exciting news. Tickets for the Conference on Religious Trauma, Court 2023, are now available. Also, if you're interested in an ad-free version of the Divorcing Religion podcast, come join me over on Patreon. Links for both are in the show notes. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious recovery consultant. I'm very pleased today to have as my guest, Lindsey Corbden. Luna was born into the LDS Mormon Church and left the faith in 2001 at age 26. Autistic and gender fluid, they are an advocate for marginalized people within or at the fringes of authoritarian religions, particularly Mormonism. And their book, Recovering Agency, Lifting the Veil of Mormon Mind Control, helps religious trauma survivors unpack their conditioning by deconstructing the manipulation techniques used by the LDS Church. And Luna spoke at the Conference on Religious Trauma just a few months ago, and it was such a delight. Welcome, Luna. It's nice to see you again.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, good to see you too.
There's so much going on in the world right now, and people are becoming more and more familiar with the idea of religious trauma and religious trauma syndrome. And I'm hearing more and more frequently from folks who are deconverting from Mormonism, and they were raised in it, and they've had many generations. There's a lot of pride in Mormon heritage. And so for these folks, if they're the first ones that are kind of breaking the link, breaking that chain, it can be really difficult and painful for them. I hope you'll tell us a little bit about your own background growing up Mormon.
Sure. Well, I was born into the church, but my parents weren't. And so I'm not one of those sometimes people call them Mormon royalty or pioneer stock or things like that. So my parents were converts, and my grandma was a member as well, but not an active member. And I was raised in the church. That was my reality. I have childhood memories where, learning about who the president of the country was, at the same time learning who the president of the church was, and kind of not really knowing where the line was between political leadership and church leadership always, so that's kind of where I came from. So, and I was pretty much a true believing Mormon. When I was a teenager, I was what you called a Molly Mormon. In other words, like I was steadfast, I was kind of judgmental and was perfect, like towed the line, stuck to the iron rod is a Mormon colloquialism about that, and kind of judgmental of people my age who weren't completely following every tiny little rule.
Were you in Utah?
I was not. I was born in Utah, but grew up in Eastern Washington, where I am now, in a little town near the Tri-Cities. Most people don't know where that is, but
okay. All right. So you were born in Utah, but you weren't living there in your teenage years when you really were quite closely embracing the Mormon theology.
Yes. I don't know if I could have kept up with a Utah Mormon's standard, because there's a lot of, there's a pretty big difference between kind of Utah Mormonism and then outside of that in terms of how orthodox they are, but a lot of it's lip service, a lot of it's very appearance based. I think this is true across the whole religion. There's a lot of appearances. We got to keep up the appearances. But particularly in Utah, there was a little bit more of just from the pressures that you're under, of a lot of people who secretly weren't were off doing their own thing in the background, people finding, legal loopholes in the doctrines, like going to Vegas and getting married for the weekend and then getting it annulled the next Monday, that kind of thing. So, and I think that people who live in Utah who leave the church are in quite a bit of a bind, because everybody in their circles is LDS. So their entire neighborhood, their next door neighbors, their boss, their entire social circle. If you run a business that's not any better, because if you've got customers, they're all LDS.
Wow.
So it can be materially a lot more difficult to leave if you live in Utah. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So you were a teenager and you were all in for the whole thing. but you're not anymore. So some interesting things must have happened along the way.
Yeah, well, one thing that happened was, there's a lot of pressure to marry young. So I married a convert. I converted him. And within that year was pregnant, and I had a full ride scholarship to BYU for 1 year, which is kind of hard to get, or at least at the time it was. And so I was kind of set, but I wasn't really, I am on the autism spectrum, and I suffer from a lot of what gifted kids do at that age, where you're kind of ready to go out into the world, and there's all these challenges. There's some great podcasts by the Healthy Gamer Gigi that talks about the whole gifted spectrum thing, but you basically end up, a lot of gifted kids end up struggling when they enter real life with meeting the demands of real life, because we missed out on a lot of life training things that most people end up going through. There's a whole thing about that. Don't want to go too far off in the weeds there, but so I really wasn't prepared to enter adulthood in any sense. And so here I had this great setup, but I felt like I kind of needed someone. And so I glommed onto like the first guy that came along. And then, but he was kind of a low key narcissist. Like he kind of wasn't, he wasn't like horrible, but he wasn't the kind of person I wanted to spend my life with. So, and there were some early signs of abuse going on, and I was also kind of a toxic person too. So we just, that really, and then I ended up a single mom because I kicked him out. And so that really, really woke me up to how reality is different than this idealistic, well, just be perfect. Can't you just be perfect? I'm perfect, So it just really woke me up to the kind of places that people end up with in their lives, and how kind of impossible those situations can be. And the scales started falling off my eyes at that point. And went, got into local community college, was raising a kid on my own. This area has a fairly high Mormon population, but it's only about 10%. So my friends in college ended up being like kind of sci-fi geeks, kind of nerd kind of people who were from all kinds of religious backgrounds and insights. One of my friends in that club was Buddhist. And there was a Satanist kid who I think was just trying to piss off his parents. But whatever, he was an avowed Satanist, wore black nail polish and eyeliner and that whole thing. And, all these different, secular ideas coming in. And I just, from there, and then I joined Codependence Anonymous, which is a 12-step program, and learned a lot of more flexible worldviews through that, take what you like and leave the rest.
Wow.
Kind of ideas from that. And so then my 20s were kind of like, I was still a believer, but I was having a hard time fitting in with the church people that were my age. And then later when they're like, you're too old to be here. And because I wasn't getting married, nobody wanted me because I was, a single parent, used goods or whatever. That's kind of how there's a lot of stigma around divorcees in Mormonism. And so, I wasn't completely active. I wasn't always like faithfully attending church. I did go to a lot of the groups for young adults, the activities kind of things, but wasn't super going to church all the time. And then there was a whole bunch of stuff leading up, like we call it, I think this is in evangelical circles as well, but my shelf broke, so I was putting all this stuff on the shelf, and these are just a few of the things that were weighing on my shelf. And then things kind of started lining up in 2000, where more and more things were going on my shelf. And I had a major episode where I felt like God broke a promise to me through like a spiritual experience I had. And then so it was like we made covenants, and I promised to do my part, and I did my part, and then God didn't follow through in like a really like Leon Festinger sort of disconfirming event kind of a way, like a way that I couldn't find loopholes around anymore. So I got mad at God, but still believed in God. And that all led up to, all right. Do you want my exit story? It's kind of nerdy. It's kind of,
nerdy. Oh, bring on the nerd. Yep.
Okay. So, so there's this idea in, sci-fi geek world called the singularity or the technological singularity. And it's this idea that technology seems to be progressing kind of exponentially. We're kind of in the arc of the curve where it goes straight up. And so that's what the singularity is, when it goes straight up. And so a lot of futurists are predicting that very, very soon, and at the time it was 20 years ago, so it wasn't quite as soon, but very, very soon we're going to invent something more intelligent than ourselves. We're going to invent artificial intelligence, or we're going to augment our own brains so that we become like mega minds. And when we do that, technological progress will just, like, our ability to invent things will just happen. And all the things that we imagine, like faster than light travel, and, you know, maybe time travel if it's possible, and teleportation, I don't know, anything that is physically possible according to laws of physics that can be invented will be solved.
Wow.
During this. That's
exciting.
Well, usually sci-fi authors take a grim view of that. Okay. So example, singularity stories would be the Terminator. Like we invent Skynet and it comes back in time to kill us, or the Matrix, where we're all just batteries of these robots. There's a ton of singularity stories. Like if I had them on the top of my head, I could list through them all, but you start to recognize them. Her is a really good one with Joaquin Phoenix, I think. And so I was thinking about this because I was in this internet group with people. We were supposed to be working on a game, but mostly we just talked about this kind of stuff. And I looked into it, and I read a couple of papers, scientific papers about it. And this one paper sparked my interest. It was kind of doom and gloom, like this, it's going to destroy us or put us in slavery or whatever. So I started thinking about that, and I put a lot of thought into, like, what would one of these higher minds be like? And I started writing an essay, and there was this little thought in the back of my head as I was sort of describing what this being would be like and why it would more likely be benevolent than malevolent. And the idea that was in the back of my mind, it didn't go into the essay, but as soon as I was done with the essay, I was like, okay, idea, what is this? And the idea is what you've just described is God. And God, the God of your religion, does not match this God. And no God of any, like, revealed authoritarian religion matches this God. And it was kind of an exploration into how something can be incomprehensible. I really recommend that process if it interests you, at least, of exploring the concept of exploring the concept of what incomprehensible really means. Like, put yourself into a position to try to comprehend something that is incomprehensible, and really go there. Like, really, really, really try to comprehend it, because that's what I did in this exercise. And I've done it since in other areas as well. Like, when you try to comprehend a God that they tell you is incomprehensible, and you come away with being like, well, he's your father, and he wants you to obey, and he wants you to follow the rules, and he wants you to pay tithing and all that kind of stuff. That is a comprehensible God. You know, there's a heaven with mansions in it. Those are all comprehensible things. But what I had done was gone to the God that is incomprehensible, realized how incomprehensible that God was. And then all of the stories that everyone was telling about God were silly. Not all of them. There are some Eastern ideas of God that I don't find silly. But all the ones that I had been exposed to up to that point, I couldn't. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's my weird sci-fi exit story.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Science fiction.
Yeah.
That is very interesting. So, how did your parents factor in when you got married, and then you had a child, and then you divorced, and you were just in your 20s at that time. And then you also didn't take the full ride that was offered. What's going on at home at that time, or like with your parents? Were they supporting you? What was happening?
They were supporting me through the divorce. I did actually go to BYU. I got pregnant at BYU and did a semester, and then had to drop out the second when I got pregnant, and my husband wasn't holding a job. So I was working and trying to do school and be pregnant at the same time. So I ended up dropping out. And they were pretty supportive. My parents didn't like this guy, so that helped. I had to do a lot of soul searching in order to do the divorce because it was stigmatized in that culture. And so I found some scriptures that supported it. If they right, I offend thee, cut it out, kind of things. So they were supportive of that, at least, less so on me leaving the church, which was 5 or 6 years after that. Yeah, okay. Something like that.
Yeah. And did they, you identify as being autistic and gender fluid. So did those things, do you feel like those things played in at all? And how were those, or were those recognized by your parents?
I didn't know I was autistic, and I didn't know like gender fluidity wasn't like even a thing that people generally talked about. And I didn't learn about that until 6, 7, 10 years ago, somewhere in there, and started slowly like realizing it. The autism, I've always been both. And I've always been, I did present as female for a long, long time, and I still relate to those memories as a woman, and as a little girl. But there was also this sort of male side of me sort of present the whole time. And so, that's kind of how I deal with that. But the autism, I didn't get my autism diagnosis till I was 36.
Oh, wow.
And I'm 47 now, so 11 years ago. And it opened up a lot of doors for me and to help me understand why I had struggled. And so it did play a role, but unbeknownst to me, the autism is probably part of why I couldn't make friends in the church as an adult. I didn't make friends that were my age as a child. The adults loved me. They thought I was great because I was trying to be perfect, I guess, or something. Yeah. I just kind of did what anybody told me to do, kind of a thing. So of course the adults loved me. So yeah, like I really didn't know any of those things when I did actually leave the church. Yeah.
And where did the giftedness part come in? Like I'm thinking of shows like The Big Bang, of course, and all these super smart folks who, some of them seem to be on the spectrum in the TV show. I mean, it's a made up show. But and they come across as very intellectually gifted. So is that an area for you as well, where you would say, yeah, that came into play for you? And and you were also very comfortable in the group at your college in Washington that you were attending.
Yeah. So I was homeschooled for one thing, starting at 3rd grade. And part of that was 4th grade, actually. My parent, the autism, especially like, I'm putting in air quotes, high functioning autism, which is how I presented. There's some problems with that terminology. But because I wasn't what they called classical autism at the time, which was the only kind they understood, the school system, nobody, had it. In fact, like hyperactive was as close to, even ADHD wasn't really a term yet.
Wow.
Just hyperactive. So, I really struggled in school. I did amazing academically. I loved taking tests. I loved learning, but that caused problems. I had an abusive teacher in 1st grade who kind of couldn't handle, she's probably narcissistic, couldn't handle a kid who's like, I know, before she even, taught anything. Which these are kind of some of the problems that gifted kids end up with, right? Like is being able to just see the answer before even anybody explains it to you is amazing. I love it, but there's a lot of downsides to it too. And you don't tend to get along with people very well unless you can learn some social skills to kind of like make that softened or bounce, I tend to be kind of blunt as well. So my parents decided to homeschool me the first year it became legal in Washington state. So 1984. And that was a mixed bag for me. I know it's a controversial issue in these spaces. so I don't want to step on anybody's toes. I think that given where I was at that time, it was the best option for me. I did end up sheltered because of it, and that was a downside. Just not exposed to a lot of real life things, which, like I mentioned, kind of struggled with then when adulthood came. But in other ways, it did protect me from the bullies. It protected me from the teachers who, I had some good teachers too, but it protected me from the not so good teachers.
Right.
And gave me a space where I could really learn how to teach myself, which is kind of what I was naturally talented at doing anyway.
Self-directed.
And I love that. Yeah, it was before the word unschooling was a thing, but kind of after the first year or two, they were just like, well, here's a textbook, go at it. And right. I would go through the textbook. I would get to the point where I felt like I understood the concept and I'd skip the rest. Like I got through really fast and I was testing really far ahead. So again, a mixed bag. I lost out on some things, but I think overall it was worse for me in public school, at least at the time.
It sounds like homeschooling for you actually had a lot of benefits
it did.
To it. And I'm so glad that your parents saw that.
Yeah.
So. And so they supported you through the divorce. It's been harder, it sounds like, for them to continue offering support as you have walked away from Mormonism. Is that accurate?
Yeah, they've been pretty good with material support. And like, to their credit, like, we've had our problems over the years and they've definitely got their flaws and we've gone through some pretty tough things between us. But like, they're unlike narcissists, which, I just came out of a narcissistic abusive relationship like 7 years ago that I'm still recovering from. Okay. There's a very big difference, and their communication style can be similar to narcissistic communication style, which is probably why I thought it was okay that my abuser was communicating like that. But ultimately, down at the root of who they are, they would rather have a good relationship with me than have a lot of the other crap which I'm really grateful for. Like, I know there's a lot of parents out there who their religion absolutely comes first, even if that means kicking the kid out and feeling no empathy for them whatsoever.
They choose religion over relationship.
Exactly. Yeah. Or other things that they're choosing the child over, whether it's their narcissism or whatever it is. And they aren't really like that, and they are capable of change, even though on the surface, like, I've had to deal with like a lot of boundary violations and repeatedly setting those boundaries and communication issues because of a lot of, like I said, these communication styles, which are in some ways kind of similar to narcissism, which is why I put up with it in my various abusers that I've had over my life.
Right. And this is something, when I work one-on-one with clients, it comes up over and over again. Codependency and often poor self-esteem and huge boundary issues. And when we're raised in fundamentalist Christianity and some other religions as well, autonomy is a bad thing. We're not encouraged to be autonomous or honor our own desires or wants or needs or anything like that. We are just to obey and serve. And so this makes it so hard for us really to become who we might be, because we just get stuck in this mold that our parents and our church want us to fit into. And so then later in life, midlife, my age, it can be really hard to figure out, well, who am I and what is important to me versus what was important to my parents. So we do a lot of values clarification as we try and figure out who we actually are and where we fit in this world.
Right. And I think some of these authoritarian religions take on the role of narcissism in the lives of the members and sort of create these narcissistic patterns for people who are capable of empathy and are capable of understanding and listening to other people and changing. The religion kind of becomes a template of narcissism.
Exactly. Exactly. And it can be so hard to even see that, let alone break free from it. I'm thrilled that you attended a codependency anonymous type group so that you could be learning learning about it, and so that you could start developing healthy patterns, so that we all can developing healthy patterns moving forward. But first we have to see the harmful patterns that are already at play.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep.
You've had a really interesting life. Are you in Yakima?
I'm not. Yakima is about an hour that way. I'm in a little town that's kind of between Tri-Cities and Yakima.
Very nice. I just was speaking. I did another podcast interview with Angela Soph, and she does live in Yakima, and she is a former Mormon and a musician. She's really a rising star on the indie charts. She's just delightful. It's just so interesting hearing from people of all different fundamentalist backgrounds, because even though some of the teachings and experiences we had were very different, there's a lot that is quite similar. And that's why group work can be helpful, where we're receiving understanding and validation and support from others who understand the pain of what it's like to try and fit in for so long, and then to come to the realization that it actually wasn't right for us anyway. And then how do we build our new life going forward? It's so wonderful that you are able to maintain a good relationship with your folks. Not everybody can do that. So that's really neat.
Not everyone can. And it's something I'm really, really grateful for. I mean, there's still a lot of issues and like the gender stuff. Like I haven't even asked them to use pronouns, and they kind of don't get it. And so there's still a lot of, points, but there's a lot worse, in the queer community and in the ex-fundamentalist communities and stuff like that. Definitely a lot worse. I'm really, really, really grateful. So, and the material support I've needed as I've, since I left my abuser, I've been disabled in a lot of ways. And so this is, I live with them now. And so that's really great to have that material support. Yeah.
You've written this book, a really helpful, insightful book. What was it like to write that book? Was it helpful for you personally?
It was, yeah. I meant to have a copy nearby me and I don't. It's over there. It's, so my story for that is, a person that I knew in Seattle. I lived in Seattle for 15 years, who was kind of running a cult of her own, but I didn't know enough to really recognize that. But I did sense that like I need to keep this person like at a distance
for you,
kind of trying to grab me. Anyway, ironically, she said she'd been raised in a cult, that her father was a cult leader, and that she asked if I'd been deprogrammed, which is, by the way, is not a term that's in the current. There's problems with that term, but she asked if I had been deprogrammed, and I was like, "Oh, I'm fine, thanks." Maybe she wanted to deprogram me. I don't know. But it kind of stuck in my craw, and so a while later I started ordering some books about cults, and started just reading them and underlining and writing margin notes, and really got into it and really saw these parallels between Mormonism and these other groups. And the manipulation patterns were what I was most interested in. Like, how did people get in, and how are they kept in? And these researchers across the board had separately kind of identified different techniques. Robert J. Lifton has his 8. And so most authors on the subject will talk about the 8, and then they'll talk about other ones. But there wasn't, at the time, at least, I hadn't found a book that was kind of like, here are all the manipulation patterns that we've learned about, and here they are in like a format that you can just flip to a page and read about that one manipulation pattern. And so I had it in my, my bucket list to write a book, because that's what I was able to do, was like, okay, here's sacred science, and here's how sacred science maps to what we were taught in Mormonism. And I would have all these like quotes come to mind, and be like, oh yeah, I remember when Prophet so-and-so said that. And
can you just quickly explain to our listeners? So sacred science comes from Lifton's 8 criteria of thought reform. Is that right?
Yes.
And so when you say sacred science, just give a brief rundown of what might that mean.
Sure. So sacred science, I say that it's what puts the total in totalism. Totalism is another word for these authoritarian systems.
Mhm.
And it kind of has three prongs. The biggest prong is that the organization or the leaders of the organization become equated with God or
Mhm.
the one way. So it's
Mhm.
kind of like we have the one way and we are the leaders and we are the only ones who have access, special access to that information. So usually in a Christian context, like for instance in Mormonism, there's a prophet, and the prophet speaks for God, and whatever the prophet said, whether it was ancient times or now, that came straight to God. And if you have any opinions or revelations from God or whatever that are different from that, you're subservient to that idea. So, and what happens is in your mind, in the mind of someone who follows this, if a scripture says, thus saith the Lord, the person's going to also think, and thus saith the leadership of my church, and
Mhm.
vice versa. If the leadership of the church says, this is how it is, you think, oh, that's what God wants. And so
Right.
they basically take on the mantle of God
Mm.
through the concept of sacred science. There's a
Mhm.
couple of other prongs to it as well. That's the core one. Just off the top of my head, one of them is the ends justify the means. So because you have this one true gospel, anything to support that is justified. I mean, you're supporting God or you're supporting
Mhm.
the one true thing. Scientology, it's Dianetics or the
Mhm.
various clearing and things like that. So forget the other prong.
That's
Just off the
okay.
top.
And so
Yeah,
your book,
that's the
did you
idea.
go through and kind of purposely look at the 8 criteria that Lifton had?
Those 8, and then I came up with whatever 8 minus 31 is,
Okay.
27, whatever. Um, math. I used to be good at it. Anyway, there are 31 techniques that I identified in across the literature, most of which had been named by other researchers, but a couple of
Sure.
them they described the dynamic and they just hadn't given it a name, so I
Mhm.
stuck a name on it. So
Nice.
there's like the double bind, black and white thinking, demand for purity, dispensation of existence,
Mhm.
like all these different ones. So, and each one of them kind of plays a role in supporting the others. They all kind of work together. You're not likely to find a cult that only uses 3 of them. Like that wouldn't really work. You might
Totally.
find a cult that doesn't use 3 of them, but uses 28 of the rest of them.
Right.
But you need at least most of them in play to one degree or another to kind of pull people in, keep them in. And then if they decide they don't believe anymore, to give them a reason to stay, they give them no
Mhm.
option to leave, even if they've decided. Like each one kind of plays one of those kind of roles.
Yes. And did you, so the book is called Recovering Agency, Lifting the Veil of Mormon Mind Control. Did you publish it yourself or was it published by someone else, by a publishing
I
house?
did I did publish it myself. I didn't shop it out. I didn't send any book proposals out. I wanted full creative control.
Yeah.
And Amazon Kindle was out at the time, was brand new, and CreateSpace were kind of new-ish, and so that gave me the opportunity to do that on with a large distribution. So it was kind of the best of both worlds. Yeah.
Yeah. Have you been pleased with how it's been taking off? Is it what you expected? Has it exceeded your expectations?
I didn't really know what to expect.
Yeah.
I think it's played out differently than I expected. Of course, I was living with my abuser at the time, and that's why I had the opportunity to
Oh,
do it,
wow.
because he was
Okay.
supporting me, and which
Mhm.
the downside of that was I was financially dependent on him,
Yeah.
and I couldn't leave him. But that's a whole other thing. Um, but all of these bad things have silver linings. Like I don't want to be toxically positive or anything like that with that, but
Right.
there's a phase in recovery where it's good to look at what you got out of the bad situation,
Yeah.
and that this is one thing I got out of that bad situation, was
Mhm.
I was able to publish this book.
Mhm. Yeah.
So
And
yeah.
have you yourself, I mean, do you encourage people to seek therapy or recovery help for their own issues related to religious trauma?
Definitely, definitely. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of help out there, which I guess is what you and I and our people in our circles are trying to do, is get more access to more people and spread
Mhm.
awareness and things like that.
Mhm.
It's my understanding, especially at least in the LDS world, the list of therapists that can kind of hit this spot is pretty small, and they tend to have long waiting lists, because there just aren't very many people that can, like, it's my understanding that a lot of ex-Mormons go to a regular therapist, and the regular therapist doesn't really understand what Mormonism is, and so they spend all their sessions educating them about all the different things, and so that's like a really big problem, even just to find a therapist who understands Mormonism but who isn't themselves the type of Mormon. And I'm specifying that because there are Mormon therapists who will meet the client where they are at and ethically guide them through their faith crisis to wherever they want to end up. But and there's a list. The Mormon Mental Health Association maintains a list of therapists who have some kind of background in Mormonism, whether they were Mormon or just have studied it, and who also agree to a code of ethics to have client-led therapy, where they're not like most LDS therapists, which are, okay, well, the church is true, so wherever this ends up, we got to end up back there.
That's right.
Which isn't ethical. It's not healthy therapy.
No, you're right. And that's why one thing that I do is frequently recommend Secular Therapy Project, seculartherapy.org, for folks who are coming out of religion and they want to meet with a qualified counselor or therapist who isn't going to be trying to turn them back to the Bible, back to their religious texts or anything like that, isn't going to be offering any of the kind of more woo type cures or ideas, but actually just using evidence-based techniques. We do need to be able to talk to someone who has an understanding of where we've come from. And for people who've never been religious, or people who are still religious and have never left religion, they don't fully understand the grief that can come along with being a part of that sealed system and then leaving the system. And that's also why I do the conference on religious trauma every year. And that's how I became connected with you, because someone who attended Court 2021, they wrote me a note after. I don't even know this person. They sent me a note and said, please consider author Lindsey Corbden.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's great. Well, I was glad to speak, and it's awesome that you run that, because organizing is not my thing. I also want to let viewers know that as a client to any therapist, you're in full control of that relationship. And I've had, like, I wanted some EMDR therapy a long time ago for something, and I was looking around, and the only therapist I could find mentioned that she was Christian on her website. And so, like, I asked her about that in the initial consultation. I said, so it says you're Christian, but I'm not. Is that going to be a problem? Are you going to be teaching me Christian principles or trying to lead me or corral me towards Christianity? Or is that going to be separate from, and she's like, no, I'll meet you wherever you are. Right. Like, just because someone's Christian doesn't mean they're going to do that. So if all you can find is a Christian therapist, you have full control to ask them about that and be upfront with them about that. And if they're honest, they'll either say, nope, I'm Christian and that's that, and we're going to talk about the Bible. Most therapists I think most therapists these days are not going to be, like, at least in Seattle where I was at the time, which is a whole thing, probably because I was in Seattle. That particular therapist was like, no, it's my therapy. I do Christianity with Christians, and but you've asked not to, so I won't, kind of a thing. So
you're right. We need to take responsibility for the relationships we enter into, including therapy type relationships. So we need to be able to ask any questions. And also, even if we're having a session and we're feeling uncomfortable by because they're saying things or doing something, we need to have a very clear relationship with our professional therapist. So I encourage people to
appreciate it. If they're a healthy therapist, they're going to appreciate it. So my therapist right now, like, sometimes I end up the therapist pet, I guess. But like, I'm really, most of the time, sometimes I don't really feel up to it. And so he'll be saying stuff that I'm not relating to at all, or just let him go. But most of the time, like, I'll be like, this isn't actually helpful for me right now. Here's where I'm headed with that. Or, well, actually, this is what I meant by that, or coming up in the next few weeks, I'd really like to focus on this.
Yes.
That, in my experience, therapists really love that. And I had a bad therapist she wasn't a bad therapist. She wasn't a really good fit for me.
Okay, yes.
She was very super CBT and positive thinking. And I've been through that. It has its place. It can be really, really helpful for you in the right place in your life. But at the time, like, I needed trauma work. I needed serious, like, this is crap. Everything sucks. Let's face that. Let's go through the swamp together. Like, that's what I really needed. And so like, after a couple of sessions of being like, no, this is what I need. This is what I need. And it just wasn't her style. Then I was able to tell her, look, I need to find a different therapist. And she was okay with that. And if a therapist gives you a hard time at that phase, you need to run away, because just because someone has a therapy license and understands mental health doesn't mean they're above being abusive or toxic. And there are some real horror stories out there of toxic therapists that have really, really abused people and pulled people in deep. So
this is so true. And sometimes it's just a mismatch for whatever reason. Maybe they remind me completely of an auntie or my mother or an uncle or someone that I had an issue with. So therapists need to be quite willing to refer out clients when it's not working. Yeah, these are such good things to talk about. It's important for people to know about these things. And what about, did you ever read, were there resources that were helping you when you left? I know a lot of folks really find encouragement in Mormon stories. Were there any websites or podcasts or books that were helpful for you?
Well, podcasts didn't exist when I left. Websites did, but there weren't a whole lot in this space, even within Mormonism. There were maybe 3 or 4 well-known websites. And when I left, and I was kind of alone when I left. It wasn't like now where there's this exodus. There wasn't Mormon stories. John DeLynn was still very happily, a Mormon at the time. His future was like at least a decade off from that, like the whole excommunication thing. So it was really, really early. So mostly what I did was I went and just explored. Well, first of all, it really helped that I had friends outside of the church. Because then I could just be like, well, I go to sci-fi cons. I'll just keep going to sci-fi cons and meet people there. And I had a friend that got me a job in Seattle, and then I just had a group. Right. So I actually had a better social life after I left Mormonism than I did.
That's terrific.
Yeah. So, and then like intellectually, emotionally, I don't think I dealt with it. Intellectually, some people recommended some books. I read a bunch of libertarian books. I read Thomas Paine's Age of Reason. I was a libertarian for a while after I left Mormonism. I was an Ayn Rand objectivist for a while after I left Mormonism. So I read a bunch of Ayn Rand, and she was really good as a new atheist, because she's very atheistic in her work. She's a poor bedfellow for the Christian right. I don't even. So she talked a lot about God and how much God sucks. And I read a bunch of like Eastern stuff, the Tao Te Ching, Eckhart Tolle's, one of his books. And of course, always reading personal self-help kind of psychology kind of books. All throughout there. So that's kind of what I did. And just also just being on the internet back when, honestly, it was better back then. It was more real, just websites and just learning. I mean, there wasn't Wikipedia, but there was the equivalent of that. There was religioustolerance.org, I think it was called. And you could just go, and they just had information on like every religion from an objective standpoint. Like, here's the good parts of the religion, here's the bad parts, and just told you like the history, and you could just learn about religion that way. And I used to donate money to them. So that's kind of what I did back in the time before all this religious trauma information that we have now.
And you actually have a great list of resources on your website, not just for folks who are divorcing Mormonism, but for all sorts of people who are recovering from religion and from religious trauma. So thank you very much for that.
I need to update it. There's a couple of there's a couple of dead links, so I do need to go through and update all my websites. But yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah.
My friend Alice Gretchen also has a wonderful website called daretodoubt.org. And Alice has a fantastic page of resources that are listed according to the belief tradition that people have come out of. So I like recommending Alice's resource page for folks as well. This has been such a treat, just getting to know even more of your backstory. And what does life look like for you now? Are you working on another book?
I'm ghostwriting right now. I have a client, and I'm working on a book for him, so which I can't talk about. And I am actually working on a book of my own right now. I don't know exactly what I'm going to do with it. I have a publisher that I'm thinking of shopping it out to. It's about half written now, and I've been thinking the last few years more about like, where do you go now from here? Like, how do you fulfill what I call your spiritual needs? Not that I'm acknowledging that invisible things exist, but that we have psychological and emotional and social needs within ourselves that traditionally have been called spiritual.
Right.
And so I'm a lot of different things led up to me writing this book, but I'm calling it a scripture because I think everyone has the right to write a scripture. I think anything that anybody creates, whatever it is, good, bad, whatever, insightful, whatever, anything that anybody creates is a work of God or scripture or authoritative or valuable or informative. And so, so because of that, that's what I'm doing. And it kind of, I'm going through the core Mormon, doctrines, and I'm taking the authoritarianism out, and I'm reinterpreting a lot of things in an anti-authoritarianism kind of a way, in a personal growth, connecting to the community kind of a way. So that's what I'm working on right now.
Very interesting. Have you ever done a foray into fiction, like any science fiction type writing?
Yeah, I'm a member of the Science Fiction Writers Association of America, and I've had a handful of short stories published out in paid markets, and I have a novel also on Amazon called Emerald City Dreamer, and it's about fairy hunters in Seattle and the fairies that are running from them, and it's a very complicated, like, who's really good in this situation kind of, like we were supposed to root for the fairy hunters, but they're not always so great. Fairies are kind of dodgy too at times. So that's what it is. It's supposed to have sequels. I've got some sequels written, but I haven't finished them and published them.
Sweet. Wow. You're really, writing is something that seems to be just in alignment with the person that you are.
Yes, it is cool. My most comfortable way to self-express. So.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for joining me today. I really enjoyed this, and I think we'll have folks watching and listening who will find it very encouraging. And I want to remind everyone, buy your tickets for the Shameless Sexuality Conference that's coming up in October. And please subscribe to the Conference on Religious Trauma YouTube channel so you never miss an episode of the Divorcing Religion podcast. And if you're so inclined, do think of supporting me on Patreon. Thanks again to our guest, Lindsey Corbden. Wonderful to see you again.
Thanks
Take care.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.